Commence primary ignition.
Hey there, friends, fans, and collectors. Welcome to another episode of Binary Sunset Review. Today we are taking a look at the first 3 episodes of Andor. Now, this show debuted last Wednesday, and it was packed with details, so we're going to jump right on into it. I think the main thing to take away about this show was that it was super, almost, like I have to say, like HBO level quality in a Star Wars universe. And that being adult themes, adult situations, and adult pacing for this show, really, too. So, I mean, really, from square one, we're getting some pretty serious sex, murder, and turmoil in the Star Wars universe that we know so dearly. And I think it set a pace not only from the start of the first episode, and I wavered to say episodes because it was released in the chunk of 3, and it really should be watched together. This truly is a Star Wars show for adults, and it has HBO quality themes and production value. I know that some of the critics out there, the show is getting a fabulous Rotten Tomatoes review and a pretty great critical review from fans out there who have watched it. This is more of an intellectual show, and a show that is crafted to have a pace that really sets and builds some fabulous tension and really unique story development. Now, we are lucky enough to have a couple different live action shows under our belt now, under the Disney Plus helm, and this felt very different and very unique from others. And it was not only the cinematic feel, but also just in general the world that they created. Now, there wasn't any fluff, any Disney fluff, any really furry guys waving at the camera or enjoying themselves. The world that we saw was very mechanic, it was very worker heavy, it was very industrial, and it was full of detail. So, I mean, unlike some of the other shows that we've seen, not that they weren't fabulous, not that they didn't hit me right in the heart where they should, but this show really told a story effectively and had some brilliant character design by having a really beautiful world around the story that they were telling. Now, there were tons of details, and this is what we hear about in like writer's school when they tell us how to craft a story. It's just fill the world around it with such beautiful and rich designs that people get information without you having to do an exposition dump. And we really didn't get any exposition dump here, and I felt fully immersed in not only the story I was watching, but the characters I was being introduced to. Because what really was fascinating also was that aside from Cassian, who we really didn't know much about, every single character on screen is brand new to us. It's really commendable and says something about the writing and the production, having walked away, feeling compelled for these characters, not knowing anything about them prior. That is something that Disney Plus hasn't done yet, so it's really nice to see this with Andor, and I believe this really has to do with the director and the writer, Tony Gilroy, and Toby, I'm forgetting his name, but a fabulous team in creating and producing this beautiful world that we're able to see and jump right into. Another criticism that we're hearing is that this show is too gritty, too dark. It doesn't feel like the Star Wars that I know. And honestly, to those critics, I would have to say that they're right in some ways of that. This didn't have the Disney fluff that we've been getting fed for the last 8 or 9 years. And I think that you have to think back to the original Star Wars. What was the most shocking scene of the original Star Wars A New Hope to everyone? It was the bar scene, the cantina scene. It blew everyone's mind, not just the fact that it was just aliens in space, but it was an active bar with violence in it. That was really groundbreaking. That was incredibly gritty for the 60s. This is way more adult than we've seen Disney take Star Wars in the last couple years. But I do not think it's out of character for Star Wars. Star Wars is a gritty environment, a gritty universe that's in the middle of galactic civil war, where death happens everywhere, where nasty things other than that happen all around us. The slave trade, the drug trade, all these kinds of things have been active in the Star Wars universe since its birth. I would also like to remind people that George Lucas almost had his own live action Star Wars show a little over a decade ago now, Star Wars Underworlds. There were hundreds of scripts that were written for episodes for Star Wars Underworld. So I wonder what parts of this, what parts of not, might have been taken from those days too. This grit has bones in Star Wars. So I would say to most people that Star Wars is returning to its roots, returning to the grounding that it initially was at, which is an unbalanced universe in the midst of a galactic civil war. Lastly, one of the most interesting themes that stayed true throughout all three of these episodes was honor. This really crafted and told us a lot about each of these characters as we were being introduced to them and seeing them move through these scenes and scenarios. But honor, every character that we saw had their own sense of honor and acted on their own sense of honor. And I think the most fascinating character out there in this 3-episode bit was Cyril Khan. Now, he was the leader of the Corpo, that weeb that was a pencil pusher who really was out of his depth and led a lot of his men into further death. And I just, the end scene, the end 20 minutes of action was just so beautifully crafted, where I was really just feeling this emotion that he was feeling, and it was palpable, it was intense, and I had such just wild ideas with where that character might be going. But it's really interesting because I was feeling these ways because honor is what made him do everything he was doing. Now, honor for him was service and duty, the uniform, doing all that kind of jazz. But I think that honor is he's gonna, as he sees more about what the Imperial Rule really is, I think he's gonna have a change of heart, and we're gonna see some real interesting transformation of this character. Honor was also an incredible theme for every other major protagonist, but I certainly think that it was the most well designed for Cyril Khan. You can't talk about the quality of this show without talking about the audio production, the sound design, and the music. Each world that we see had its own theme, had its own feel, and it really did set the tone and the pace beautifully as we're learning about these characters. Now, the initial planet we see in flashbacks, Kenari, has its own really ethereal, very earthy tone to it, as well as Ferrix has this industrial kind of moving feel to it. Morlana 1 had this very traditional sci-fi Blade Runner feel. And all of these music elements and audio elements added up incredibly. There were also a lot of auditory signs that really built the story and added character to the place that we were seeing. The planet of Ferrix was built around audio signals. From the bells they wake up to, tolling the time that tells them to get off work, and then again announcing them to leave work, to the signals that they had when the Corpos arrived to call to arms or to go back in homes and to hide from what's going on. It really did tell and shape the culture of this planet which we're being introduced to for the first time. There have been many different Disney Plus shows out there, and the majority of these live action shows that we've seen have used the new technology called the gallery. Now, this is the big walk-through screen that produces a different scene and really doesn't need as much set development, as much set creation. All of the work with the gallery is done in California, out in LA on their studio there. Andor was shot in England, and Andor was shot in London, where they have a huge studio and set, and it was also done using the old ways, the traditional ways of Star Wars. And we were reading in the Vanity Fair articles leading up to this show how there were full working cities you could walk through, apartments you could open doors to and sit down in, look out the windows down on a scene happening, just, and you can feel it when you watch this show. That it really different, it matters, and the gallery is beautiful, I was blown away by it, but it really, really does matter and really feels Star Warsy when you can have a set you can walk through, light things differently from in terms of production value. With Andor, they really did go with the old ways of creating sets and having an active scene you could walk through and move through with props. And this really speaks volumes to the actual story and the feeling and the immersion that not only the actors get, but also the audience gets when viewing it. Diversity in the Star Wars universe has been lacking for 40 years, 50 years now. It's really nice that we're finally seeing some diversity in the world, and it's exciting to know as a Latino that we can now say our home planet is either Kenari or Tahina, with these dark eyes, dark hair, and dark skin. Super, super cool, because representation really does matter to the Star Wars fans out there who have been loving this universe our entire lives, but are yet to have found our home planet and place in it. They had a whole language, and they had a whole separate scenes that were entirely in Kenari, and we didn't get subtitles as viewers. And a lot of people were thinking their Disney Plus was malfunctioning, but this was specifically done from a production value of us not understanding and not knowing. The Kenari language had a unique accent and no translation to basic for in the Star Wars universe. So this separates it from the rest of the world in a different way. Andor was thematically set with a corporate imperial mindset. Now what this really meant was money over everything, industrial productivity over everything, and people at the very bottom, if at all. This is an incredibly intimidating, neo-fascistic, almost feudal kind of way to live, and this is how the Empire was living at the fascinating date of 5 BBY. We haven't seen the date 5 BBY in a while, or in Disney, correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly in a live action series we haven't seen this date. This date was originally from the Star Wars expanded universe in the books back in the 90s. I remember having this book as a kid and seeing the huge timeline on the page, and it's great to see that finally in a live action series as a stamp that we know and can immediately bring to memory. Under Imperial Rule, resources and productivity equal your value, not only to them, but to also the amount of Imperial oversight you're going to get. Now, this is interesting when we compared to Cloud City and the gas kind of monopoly that they had set up there. Now, even Lando said this in Empire, that even they pay enough in gas, they pay enough taxes to the Empire, that they let them run Cloud City and Bespin as they choose. And we can actually compare almost, I'm sure that this was I'm sure this was on purpose, that the Corpo uniforms actually look very similar to the Bespin Guard uniforms. So maybe they were a different or a similar corporate alliance in a different mid-rim system. In the absence of stormtroopers, these private military companies are overseeing Imperial Rule, and they're doing it with an iron thumb. And these entities, as we've seen with the Corpos here, these blues are lacking in any real-world experience, overly funded, and overly hyped on their own elitist kind of dogma of we rule, we control, we uphold, we do. We can see this in the third episode when it comes to the edge and when the action happens. These people who showed up in force really get decimated by 2 individuals alone. Another example of the Imperial corporate mindset is how cavalier people are about the Kenari mining disaster. The fact that Kenari was either overmined or something even more sinister or tactical happened there, which labeled the planet entirely inert and unlivable. Now, we don't know if this is a common thing that happens under Imperial Rule, but people's reaction to it make us think that it might be, which is terrifying. This planet's also symbolic for just a lack of care for the universe around it. This planet being overmined to an ecological disaster led to the death of everyone on the planet. Now, obviously, not everyone. These kids were probably the children of the miners, and they somehow grew up immune to certain gases or certain whatever, which is, again, really cool. And hopefully, we'll see that later in the story maybe play. There also exists in the Star Wars universe planned ecological disasters, so world killing mass biological weapons that have been used and launched against planets politically, both in war and out of war, by the Empire in red flag and false flag environments. Now, these things are in the Star Wars expanded universe, but it's particularly horrifying and cool that we're finally seeing them brought into canon in some of these worlds, like Kenari. We know from the trailers that we're going to be seeing clone troopers, and the primary antagonists so far have been these corporate private entities. It's really interesting that at 5 BBY, which is it's a decade into Imperial Rule, that in the mid-rim itself, some of these planets still don't have an Imperial oversight, Imperial garrisons, or stormtroopers to oversee Imperial Rule. Now, be this due to the contracts we were talking about previously, or just the fact that at this time, the Empire is spread so thin and might not have trained stormtroopers or enough of an Imperial Navy to oversee every single planet, even in the mid-rim. This is really, really interesting to think about because the Empire took time to spread out, took time to develop, and honestly, in the timeline of the Star Wars universe, really didn't last that long. I think the best example of how they're handling these adult themes differently and better is how death is used in this show. Now, we've seen tons of people die in Star Wars, especially in the Disney world. We've seen bad guys get hurled and die in the most horrible ways, but we've never really seen death in kind of the grounded way that we saw in Andor. From the first initial scene where Cassian kills those 2 Corpo guards, to the reaction of the children, the Kenari children, when their leader gets shot, to their screams and then murder, to even the Corpo guy when he kills Tim, having his officer taking his rifle away and telling him to go. Like that we've never seen that before. It feels like it has gravity for the first time in a while in the Star Wars universe. When we see death in Andor, we're given time to think about it, we're given time to care. And they do this in such a uniquely short amount of time when you think about it, that it really speaks volumes not only to the character development, but also the story that we're being given. Andor is incredibly honest with how death is. It's not to be celebrated, and we feel it each time it happens. So reflecting on death this way, even with minor characters or antagonists. There weren't many Easter eggs in the first 3 episodes, but I did pick them out. Most of them were ships that were seen in the shipyard. There was a VCX-100 that, as anybody knows, is the Ghost. It definitely wasn't the Ghost, because in this timeline, Hera's flying it around somewhere, but in that shipyard, we also saw a Y-Wing with its engines cut off, and those engines were actually on the transport that Cassian took. So it was neat to see that junkyard, that scrap being used like that. And the biggest one of all, which everybody's going wild for, was Cassian's pistol. Cassian's Briar pistol was, of course, first seen by Kyle Katarn in the Dark Forces series of games. And this is a brilliant nod also because the first storyline of that game was actually stealing the Death Star plans. So Cassian and the Rogue One team did inherit in canon this storyline, of course, but it's great to have that nod of the Briar pistol there in this episode and hopefully continuing on in the show. This pistol in Star Wars canon is a sawed-off rifle. That's what gives it its special ability, which in the game is a charge-up ability, which is pretty neat, where you could charge it up and shoot it like a shotgun or shoot a big old bolt at whoever you're aiming at. And just a really, really neat Easter egg that everybody's going wild for. Thanks for watching another episode of Binary Sunset Review. As always, I've been Mike. We are going to continue to do these after show episodes where we're talking about the episode itself and dissecting it, As everyone can see, we've had a shift in studio. We have a new space that I've been getting used to and getting everything set up in. Stay tuned as we continue to have our normal reviews and, of course, these after shows of the Andor. I almost said Kenobi, and these after shows of the Andor episodes. Thanks for watching again. If you haven't subscribed, make sure to hit that subscribe button below and hit the bell to notify yourself when we have new episodes, because we will each week moving out. Have a great day out there. Stay safe, stay sane, and remember, the Force will be with you. Always.
I'm just a simple man trying to make my way in the universe.